The cemetery was empty except for one man and one boy. The man stood before a tombstone, his face carved by grief, his hands trembling as he traced the engraved name, his son's name. 3 years had passed since the tragedy, yet the pain never faded. But today was different. A fragile voice broke the silence. A boy, barefoot, covered in dust, stood just a few steps away. His eyes, wide, haunted, locked onto the grieving father's, and then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said something that made the world stop. He didn't die the way they told you. The early morning mist hung heavy over Oakwood Cemetery in Boston, Massachusetts, where marble headstones stretched endlessly across the carefully manicured grounds. A fine, persistent drizzle fell from the gray November sky, making the polished stone slick beneath Cassius Hawthorne's trembling fingers. At 52, the self-made millionaire had everything money could buy, yet here he stood, broken and alone, at the grave that had shattered his world 3 years ago. The headstone read, Silas James Hawthorne, beloved son, 1998-2021. Cassius traced the engraved letters as he had done countless times before, each touch a reminder of the devastating void left by his only child's death. The rain mixed with his tears, running down his weathered face and dripping onto his expensive Italian wool coat, a stark reminder of the wealth that couldn't save his son. 3 years had passed since that horrific night when the police knocked on his door with news that would forever divide his life into before and after. 3 years of silent visits to this same spot, where the manicured grass had grown and died and grown again over the earth that held his greatest treasure. The raw, screaming grief had gradually transformed into a phantom that followed him, everywhere, an ever-present ghost that haunted his empty mansion in Beacon Hill. Cassius had grown accustomed to the cemetery's solemn silence, broken only by distant traffic and the occasional mourner's footsteps. He knew every crack in the surrounding headstones, every bird that nested in the ancient oak trees, every shadow that crossed his son's final resting place. But today something was different. Something was wrong. Through the curtain of rain, he noticed a small figure kneeling before Silas's grave, a boy, no more than 12 or 13, wearing clothes that hung in tatters from his thin frame. His bare feet were caked with mud, his dark skin marked with streaks of dirt and tears. The child's shoulders shook with silent sobs as he pressed his forehead against the cold marble. Cassius froze, his heart pounding against his ribs. In 3 years, he had never seen anyone else at this grave. Silas's friends had stopped visiting after the first year, and their relatives paid their respects only on major holidays. Who was this child, and why was he crying at his son's grave? Before Cassius could find his voice, the boy raised his head, revealing eyes red-rimmed from crying. Their gazes met through the rain, and the child's expression shifted from grief to something else. Fear, perhaps, or determination. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper but clear as a church bell in the morning silence, he spoke words that sent ice through Cassius's veins. He didn't die the way they said. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Cassius grabbed the headstone for support, his knees threatening to buckle beneath him. The rain suddenly felt like needles against his skin, each drop a tiny shock of reality trying to wake him from what must surely be a nightmare. "What did you say?" he managed to croak, his voice rough with emotion and disbelief. The boy glanced nervously over his shoulder, as if expecting to see someone watching from behind the rows of graves. His small hands clutched at the wet grass, tearing pieces from the earth as he struggled with some internal battle. "Silas," he continued, his voice trembling. "He tried to warn me, but nobody would listen." Cassius's mind reeled. Questions exploded in his thoughts like fireworks, each one demanding immediate attention. How did this child know his son's name? What warning was he talking about? And most importantly, what did he mean about Silas's death? The official report had been clear. A tragic car accident on a rainy night, not unlike this one. Clean, simple, devastating in its finality. Fighting to maintain his composure, Cassius took a careful step forward, not wanting to frighten the boy away. "Who are you?" he asked, trying to keep his voice gentle despite the storm of emotions raging inside him. "How did you know my son?" The child's lower lip trembled as he whispered, Finian, then hunched his shoulders as if the weight of his own name was too heavy to bear. That's all I can say right now. They're watching. They're always watching. Before Cassius could react, Finian sprang to his feet with surprising agility. His bare feet barely seemed to touch the wet grass as he darted between the headstones, disappearing into the thickening fog like a ghost. Cassius tried to follow, but his legs wouldn't move. Years of business meetings and high-stakes negotiations had taught him to maintain his composure in any situation. But this was different. He stood there in the rain, staring at the spot where the boy had knelt, his mind churning with possibilities he had forced himself not to consider for 3 years. Something inside him, something he had buried as deeply as his son, whispered that this child knew secrets that were never meant to be uncovered. The rain continued to fall, washing away any trace of Finian's presence, but Cassius knew with absolute certainty that his life had just changed again. The grief he had learned to live with was transforming into something else, something with teeth and claws that would not let him rest until he uncovered the truth. As he finally turned to leave the cemetery, Cassius cast one last look at his son's grave. The polished marble seemed to hold new mysteries now, and the words etched in stone felt like the first page of a story he never knew existed. Whatever truth lay behind Finian's words, whatever dark secrets surrounded his son's death, Cassius would not stop until he uncovered them all. The comfortable numbness of the past 3 years had been shattered by 5 simple words from a mysterious child. Now standing in the rain at his son's grave, Cassius Hawthorne made a silent vow. He would find Finian again, and this time, he would learn everything. The rest of that rain-soaked day passed in a blur for Cassius Hawthorne. Back in his Beacon Hill mansion, he paced the mahogany-floored study where he'd spent countless nights after Silas's death, drinking expensive scotch and staring at family photos. But tonight was different. Tonight, those 5 words from the mysterious boy echoed in his mind like a haunting refrain. He didn't die like they said. The grandfather clock in the corner struck midnight, its deep chimes reverberating through the empty house. Cassius stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the city lights shimmer through the continuing drizzle. His reflection stared back at him, a successful man by all outward appearances, with his tailored suit and perfectly groomed silver hair. But his eyes told a different story. They held the haunted look of a father who had just learned that his greatest tragedy might be something far more sinister. Unable to silence the questions swirling in his mind, Cassius did something he hadn't done in years. He reached for his phone and scrolled to a number he'd kept but never used. Marcus Reynolds, the private investigator he'd hired immediately after Silas's death. Back then, Marcus had conducted a thorough investigation that ultimately supported the police's conclusion: a tragic accident on a rainy night, nothing more. But now, his finger hovered over the call button as doubt crept in. Was he really going to reopen this wound based on the words of a mysterious child? What if Finian was just some troubled kid making up stories? But then he remembered the look in the boy's eyes, the genuine fear when he mentioned being watched. With trembling fingers, he pressed dial. The phone rang 3 times before a gruff voice answered. "Reynolds here." Despite the late hour, Marcus sounded alert, as if he'd been expecting this call. "Marcus, it's Cassius Hawthorne." He paused, suddenly aware of how crazy he might sound. "I need to talk about Silas's case." There was a long silence on the other end. Finally, Marcus spoke, his voice careful and measured. "It's been 3 years, Mr. Hawthorne. What's changed?" Cassius took a deep breath and recounted his encounter with Finian. As he spoke, he could hear the rustling of papers on Marcus's end. The investigator was taking notes. When he finished, Marcus remained quiet for several moments. "Mr. Hawthorne," he said finally, "I need to tell you something. I've kept your son's file open on my desk for 3 years. Something about that case never sat right with me, but I couldn't put my finger on it. Maybe now." Cassius's heart raced. "What are you saying, Marcus?" "I'm saying that maybe this boy's appearance isn't a coincidence. Meet me tomorrow morning at the Thinking Cup on Tremont Street, 9 a.m. There's something you need to see." After hanging up, Cassius couldn't sleep. He spent the rest of the night in Silas's old room, untouched since the day he died. Everything remained exactly as his son had left it. The MIT engineering textbooks on the desk, the vintage movie posters on the walls, even the half-finished robotics project gathering dust in the corner. Silas had been brilliant, destined for greatness. The official story said he'd lost control of his car on a wet road, but Silas had been an exceptionally careful driver, especially in bad weather. As dawn broke over Boston, Cassius found himself back at his son's grave. The morning fog was thick, creating an ethereal atmosphere as he searched for any sign of Finian. The groundskeeper was already at work, trimming the grass between the headstones. "Excuse me," Cassius called out, approaching the older man. "Have you seen a young boy around here? African American, probably 12 or 13, usually barefoot." The groundskeeper leaned on his rake, his weathered face thoughtful. "Ah, you mean the flower boy. Yeah, he comes around sometimes, leaves flowers on different graves. Been seeing him for about 3 years now, I'd say. Never talks to anyone, though. Just leaves his flowers and disappears." Cassius felt his pulse quicken. 3 years. Exactly how long Silas had been gone. "Does he leave flowers on any particular graves?" The old man scratched his chin. "Now that you mention it, yeah, there's a pattern to it. Always the newer graves, ones from the last few years. Mostly young folks, if I remember right. Accidents, mostly." A chill ran down Cassius's spine despite the warming morning air. What connection did Finian have to these deaths? Was he just a troubled soul seeking connection with the deceased, or was there something more sinister at play? As Cassius turned to leave, something caught his eye. There, tucked under his windshield wiper, was a crumpled envelope. His hands shook as he opened it, finding a single handwritten note inside. "Look into his past. They lied to you." The word "they" seemed to jump off the page. Who were they? And why did this note feel both like a warning and a threat? As he stood there clutching the mysterious message, Cassius realized that his comfortable world of grief and acceptance was crumbling. In its place, something darker and more dangerous was taking shape. A mystery that threatened to unravel everything he thought he knew about his son's death. The sound of approaching footsteps made him quickly pocket the note. It was time to meet Marcus and maybe finally begin to uncover the truth that had been hiding in plain sight for 3 years. As he drove toward downtown Boston, Cassius couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Perhaps Finian's paranoia wasn't so unfounded after all. With mounting anxiety coursing through his veins, Cassius sat in his study, surrounded by the remnants of Silas's life. The antique mahogany desk that had witnessed countless late-night business deals was now covered with old photographs, school records, and newspaper clippings. A single lamp cast long shadows across the room as he pulled out a weathered cardboard box he hadn't opened since the funeral. His hands trembled as he lifted the lid, releasing the faint scent of his son's cologne that still clung to the contents. Each item inside was a precious memory: Silas's high school valedictorian medal, his MIT acceptance letter, the robot he'd built that won first place at the state science fair. But tonight, Cassius wasn't seeking comfort in memories, he was searching for clues. As he carefully sorted through the box's contents, something unexpected caught his eye. A leather-bound journal he'd never seen before. The binding was worn, suggesting frequent use, but Silas had never mentioned keeping a diary. Cassius's heart raced as he opened it, recognizing his son's distinctive handwriting, precise and analytical, just like his engineering mind. The first few entries were typical of a brilliant young man navigating his final year at MIT: project deadlines, research breakthroughs, complaints about demanding professors. But as Cassius continued reading, the tone changed dramatically. The neat handwriting became increasingly erratic, the entries more fragmented and disturbing. One passage from 2 weeks before Silas's death made Cassius's blood run cold. "If anything happens to me, don't believe them." The words were underlined, multiple times, the pen having torn through the paper in places. Surrounding this warning were scattered phrases that seemed to make no sense. Project Shadow. They're watching the lab. Can't trust anyone anymore. Cassius felt his professional composure crumbling. Silas had never been prone to paranoia or conspiracy theories. He was a pragmatist, like his father, focused on facts and logic. What could have scared him so badly in those final weeks? And who were they? As he turned to the final pages, his phone suddenly vibrated, making him jump. It was Marcus Reynolds, the private investigator. The message was brief, but urgent. "I found something strange in the autopsy report. We need to meet. Now." Cassius checked his watch, 11:30 p.m. The city would be quieting down, but he knew sleep would be impossible now. He texted back a quick agreement and started gathering his things. As he reached for the journal, another piece of paper slipped from between its pages. A torn fragment covered in hurried calculations and a series of letters and numbers that made no sense to him. Just then, a floorboard creaked somewhere in the house. Cassius froze, listening intently. He lived alone and his security system was state-of-the-art. Yet something felt off. The hair on the back of his neck stood up as he heard another subtle sound, like someone trying very hard to move, silently. Moving quickly but quietly, he slipped the journal and the mysterious paper into his jacket pocket. The sound came again, closer now from the direction of the main hallway. Cassius's mind raced back to Finian's warning about being watched. Had someone followed him home? Were they after the same answers he was seeking? He reached for his phone to call security but stopped short. If someone had managed to get past his alarm system, they might have compromised other systems as well. Instead, he moved toward the study's French doors that led to the back garden. Years of business dealings had taught him to always have an exit strategy. As he slipped outside into the cool night air, a shadow moved across the window he'd just left. Someone was definitely in his house. Cassius made his way quickly through the manicured garden, his expensive shoes crushing wet grass as he headed for the garage where he kept his less conspicuous car, a modest Toyota instead of his usual Mercedes. His hands shook as he started the engine, trying to process what was happening. His son's cryptic journal entries, the mysterious break-in, Finian's warnings. It all pointed to something far more sinister than a simple car accident. But what could Silas have discovered that was worth killing for? The drive to meet Marcus seemed to take forever, every shadow and passing car a potential threat. When he finally pulled into the empty parking lot behind their meeting spot, a 24-hour diner in Somerville, Cassius felt years older than he had that morning. The weight of uncertainty and fear pressed down on him like a physical force. Marcus was already waiting, his weathered face grave in the harsh fluorescent lighting. As Cassius slid into the booth across from him, the investigator spoke without preamble. "Mr. Hawthorne, your son's body showed traces of a substance that wasn't included in the official toxicology report, something they deliberately left out." Cassius felt the world tilt sideways. "What kind of substance?" "That's the thing," Marcus said, leaning forward. "It's not in any database I can access. But here's what's really interesting. I found similar trace elements in 2 other accident victims from the same time period. Both young, both brilliant in their fields, both with connections to research projects at MIT. The implications hit Cassius like a physical blow. His son's death wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern that someone had gone to great lengths to hide. And now, with an intruder in his home and his son's mysterious journal burning a hole in his pocket, Cassius realized he'd stumbled onto something far bigger and more dangerous than he could have imagined. The Thinking Cup on Tremont Street was already bustling with morning commuters when Cassius arrived. The rich aroma of freshly ground coffee filled the air as he scanned the vintage-inspired cafe for Marcus Reynolds. The private investigator sat in a corner booth, his worn leather briefcase on the table beside a steaming cup of black coffee. Despite the early hour, dark circles under his eyes suggested he'd gotten as little sleep as Cassius had. Cassius slid into the booth, acutely aware of every person in the cafe. After last night's intrusion, paranoia had become his constant companion. The friendly barista calling out orders, the young couple sharing a muffin, the businessman typing on his laptop. Any of them could be watching. His hands trembled slightly as he accepted the coffee Marcus ordered for him. "I've been reviewing everything," Marcus said in a low voice, sliding a manila folder across the table. There are inconsistencies in the medical reports that I missed 3 years ago, or maybe I didn't want to see them. He opened the folder, revealing the autopsy report. Cassius felt his stomach lurch at the clinical description of his son's injuries, but forced himself to focus. Marcus pointed to a section of the report. Look here. The injection marks on his arm weren't mentioned in the initial investigation. His weathered finger traced the line of text. According to this, there were multiple puncture marks, consistent with repeated injections. But Silas, he paused, glancing at Cassius. Silas was terrified of needles. Cassius finished, his voice barely above a whisper. The memory hit him like a physical blow. 8-year-old Silas crying at the doctor's office, refusing his flu shot until Cassius promised him a new robotics kit. Even as a young adult, he'd avoided blood tests whenever possible. He would never willingly allow multiple injections. Marcus nodded grimly. Exactly. And there's more. He pulled out another document, this one marked with highlighted sections. The toxicology report shows traces of an unidentified substance in his bloodstream, something the lab couldn't identify. But here's where it gets strange. This information was buried in the supplementary reports. It never made it into the official findings. Cassius felt the coffee turn bitter in his mouth. Someone deliberately omitted this information? Someone with enough authority to manipulate official medical records. Marcus leaned back, his face grave. I did some digging. In the months before Silas's death, there were 2 other fatal accidents involving young people connected to MIT. Both had similar unidentified compounds in their systems. Both cases were quickly closed as accidents. A chill ran down Cassius's spine as he remembered Finian's words at the cemetery. The boy had known something was wrong. But how? And why was he choosing to reveal it now? There's something else, Marcus said, hesitating. The investigating officer for all 3 cases was the same person, Detective James Morrison. He retired suddenly 2 months after Silas's death, moved to Florida. No forwarding address. Cassius's mind raced. A detective who disappeared, evidence that was buried, mysterious substances, and his brilliant son's hidden fears. The pieces were there, but the picture they formed was too terrible to contemplate. Mr. Hawthorne, Marcus said softly, I think your son stumbled onto something at MIT, something big enough that someone wanted to keep it quiet. Permanently. Just then, Cassius noticed a familiar face through the cafe window, a uniformed police officer he recognized from his frequent visits to the cemetery. The officer's eyes met his for a brief moment before he quickly looked away and continued walking. Was it just paranoia? Or had the officer been watching them? We need to be careful, Marcus said, following Cassius's gaze. If what I suspect is true, we're dealing with people who have resources and influence, people who've already proven they're willing to kill to protect their secrets. Cassius pulled out Silas's journal from his jacket pocket, explaining about the break-in at his house. As Marcus examined the cryptic entries, his frown deepened. These notes, he said, pointing to a series of numbers and letters. They look like some kind of code. Your son was trying to document something, but he wanted to make sure only the right person could understand it. The implications were staggering. Silas hadn't just died in an accident, he'd been silenced. And now, 3 years later, a mysterious boy named Finian had appeared, carrying pieces of a truth that powerful people wanted to keep buried. As they left the cafe, Cassius felt the weight of his son's journal in his pocket like a live bomb. Whatever Silas had discovered, it had cost him his life. Now his father was on the same dangerous path, pursuing answers that could prove equally fatal. Watch your back, Marcus warned as they parted. And Mr. Hawthorne, if you see that boy, again, be careful. He might know more than he's letting on, but that knowledge could get him killed too. Walking back to his car, Cassius felt eyes on him from every direction. The comfortable world he'd known, of business deals and board meetings, of predictable patterns and controllable outcomes, was crumbling around him. In its place, a darker reality was emerging, one where his son's final days were filled with fear and desperate attempts to expose a truth that someone would kill to protect. The following morning dawned cold and clear over Boston's Oakwood Cemetery. a stark contrast to the misty day when Finian first appeared. Cassius arrived just as the first rays of sunlight began to pierce through the bare November trees, casting long shadows across the frost-covered graves. His expensive wool coat did little to ward off the bone-deep chill that had nothing to do with the weather. He made his way to Silas's grave, his footsteps crunching on the frozen grass. The revelations from Marcus's investigation weighed heavily on his mind. Each step felt like moving through molasses as the questions multiplied. Who had injected his needle-phobic son? What was the mysterious substance in his blood? And most importantly, what had Silas discovered that was worth killing for? As he approached the familiar headstone, his heart nearly stopped. There, kneeling in the same position as before, was Finian. The boy looked even more fragile in the harsh morning light, his thin jacket offering little protection against the cold. His bare feet were blue-tinged and Cassius could see him shivering. "You found something, didn't you?" Finian's voice was barely above a whisper, his breath visible in the frigid air. He didn't turn around, keeping his eyes fixed on Silas's headstone. "I can see it in your face. You know now that I wasn't lying." Cassius approached carefully, like one might approach a wounded animal. Up close, he could see fresh bruises on Finian's arms, partially hidden by his ragged sleeves. Someone had hurt this child recently. The protective instinct that had died with Silas suddenly flared back to life. "Who did this to you?" Cassius asked, gesturing to the bruises. But Finian shook his head, wrapping his arms tighter around himself. "They're everywhere," he whispered, eyes darting nervously around the cemetery. "In the police, in the hospitals, in the schools. They watch everything. They knew as soon as I talked to you." He finally looked up at Cassius, his dark eyes filled with a wisdom far beyond his years. Just like they knew when Silas started asking questions. Cassius felt his pulse quicken. "What questions, Finian? What did my son discover?" The boy's lower lip trembled. "He was trying to help me. I was just a kid living on the streets, but he saw me, really saw me. He used to bring me food, clothes." Finian's voice cracked. Then one day he saw something he wasn't supposed to see. At the lab, he started investigating, asking questions about the other kids like me who disappeared. Other kids? Cassius felt sick. What happened to them? Finian's eyes filled with tears. The same thing that happened to Silas. Accidents. Always accidents. But Silas, he was different. He kept records. He had proof. The boy's voice dropped, even lower. That's why they had to stop him. Before Cassius could press further, Finian suddenly tensed. "Someone's coming," he whispered urgently. "I shouldn't be here. They'll hurt me again if they catch me talking to you." "Wait." Cassius reached out but stopped short of touching the boy. "Let me help you. You can stay with me. I can protect you." "No one can protect me," Finian cut him off, already backing away. "But there's something you need to know." He glanced around one final time before leaning in close. "It wasn't strangers who did this. It was someone in your own family." The words hit Cassius like a physical blow. He staggered back, his mind reeling. "What? That's impossible. Who?" But Finian was already running, his bare feet silent on the frozen ground as he disappeared between the headstones. This time, though, Cassius noticed which direction he went, toward the old mausoleum on the cemetery's east side. As distant footsteps approached, Cassius quickly composed himself. A groundskeeper rounded the corner, nodding respectfully as he passed. But was it really just a groundskeeper? After everything he'd learned, every casual encounter felt potentially sinister. Standing alone at his son's grave, Cassius tried to process Finian's explosive revelation. Someone in his family had been involved in Silas's death? The idea seemed incomprehensible. His family was small, just him, his younger brother Jasper, and a few distant cousins he rarely saw. Jasper had been devastated by Silas's death, had helped arrange the funeral, had supported Cassius through the worst days of his grief. But then, hadn't Jasper also been the one who identified Silas's body, who handled all the paperwork with the police, who insisted that Cassius not view the body saying he should remember his son as he lived. Cold sweat broke out on Cassius's forehead, despite the freezing temperature. He remembered something else. Jasper had worked as a research consultant for several MIT labs, including the one where Silas spent most of his time. Had his own brother betrayed him in the worst possible way? As the sun climbed higher in the winter sky, Cassius made a silent vow. He would find Finian again, protect him from whoever was causing those bruises. And then together, they would uncover the full truth about Silas's death. No matter where that truth led, no matter who it implicated, no matter how much it hurt. Because if someone in his family had helped murder his son, there would be a reckoning. And all the money and power in Boston wouldn't be enough to protect them from a father's vengeance. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Cassius's study as he methodically pieced together everything he knew. His normally immaculate desk was covered with papers, printouts of Silas's old emails, research papers, photos, and the mysterious journal entries he'd been trying to decode for hours. His tablet displayed news articles about other accidents at MIT around the time of Silas's death, each one involving promising young researchers. Finian's words about family betrayal had shaken him to his core, forcing him to view every memory, every interaction through a new, darker lens. His brother Jasper's face smiled up at him from an old Christmas photo. Jasper with his arm around Silas, both of them wearing silly holiday sweaters. Had it all been a mask? Had Jasper really been capable of participating in his own nephew's murder? The study door creaked open, making Cassius jump. But it was only Mrs. Sullivan, his housekeeper of 20 years, bringing his evening coffee. She paused in the doorway, concern etching her weathered face. "Mr. Hawthorne, you haven't eaten all day. Shall I bring you something?" Cassius shook his head, forcing a smile. "Thank you, Eleanor, but I'm not hungry." His eyes drifted back to the papers spread before him. Did you ever notice anything strange about Silas in those last few weeks? Anything different about his behavior?" Mrs. Sullivan set down the coffee cup, her hands trembling slightly. She hesitated, then seemed to come to a decision. There was something, the week before the accident. I heard him arguing with someone on the phone. He was in his room, but his voice carried. He kept saying, "You can't keep doing this, and they're just children." She wrung her hands in her apron. "I should have told you sooner, but with everything that happened." Cassius felt his heart rate accelerate. Children. Finian had mentioned other street kids who disappeared. "Did you hear who he was talking to?" "No, sir." But afterward he came downstairs looking terrible. Pale. Shaking. He asked me not to tell anyone about the call. Tears welled in her eyes. The next day was the accident. I've carried that guilt ever since. Cassius reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "It's not your fault, Eleanor. None of us knew what was really happening." Even as he spoke the words, anger burned in his chest. How many people had seen signs but stayed silent? How many had looked the other way while his son fought a battle they couldn't understand? After Mrs. Sullivan left, Cassius turned back to Silas's journal. The coded entries had to mean something. His son had been brilliant with patterns, with numbers. He wouldn't have made it unnecessarily complicated. Cassius rubbed his tired eyes, staring at the seemingly random sequences until they blurred together. Then something clicked. The numbers, they weren't random at all. They were dates and times, but written in a modified binary code Silas had developed for one of his robotics projects. Cassius's hands shook as he began transcribing them, converting the sequences into regular dates. What emerged was chilling. Each entry corresponded to a different location around MIT's campus, times when Silas had witnessed something. The last entry was dated the day before his death, 11:30 p.m., Building 68, Basement Level 3. Cassius knew that building. It housed several high-security research labs, including one where Jasper occasionally consulted. His brother had keycard access to areas most people never saw. As this realization sank in, His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Backlot of the diner, 15 minutes, come alone. F. Finian. The boy was reaching out again despite the risk. Cassius grabbed his coat, but as he reached for his keys, another text came through. Don't trust the police. They're part of it. His hands trembled as he made his way to the garage. The weight of each new revelation pressed down on him like a physical force. His son's death wasn't just murder. It was part of something bigger, something that reached into the highest levels of power in Boston. And somehow, impossibly, his own brother was involved. The drive to the diner felt like moving through a nightmare. Every traffic light, every passing car, every shadow could hide someone watching, waiting. But he had to know the truth. Had to understand what Silas had discovered that was worth killing for. As he pulled into the back lot of the diner, his headlights swept across a small figure huddled behind a dumpster. Finian stepped into the light, his face bearing fresh bruises. The sight made Cassius's blood boil. Someone was still hurting this child, trying to silence him just as they had silenced Silas. You found something in his writing, Finian said as Cassius approached. It wasn't a question. You know where to look now. Building 68, Cassius replied softly. What was he investigating there? Finian glanced nervously over his shoulder before answering. The missing kid, they were taking us there, experiments, tests. Silas found out and tried to stop it. His voice cracked. Your brother. He was there too. He saw everything. The truth hit Cassius like a physical blow. His brother hadn't just been involved. He had been a witness, a participant. And when Silas threatened to expose it all, they had silenced him permanently. I'll help you prove it, Finian whispered. But you have to promise me something. He looked up at Cassius, his young face hard with determination. Promise you'll make them pay. All of them. For Silas, and for all the others they hurt. Looking into the boy's eyes, Cassius saw the same fierce intelligence, the same burning need for justice that he had seen in his son. He reached out and gently squeezed Finian's shoulder. I promise we'll make them pay. Together. The November sun was setting over Boston's skyline as Cassius sat in his parked car outside Building 68 on MIT's campus, his heart pounding against his ribs. He hadn't been here since Silas's death. The modernist glass and steel structure had held too many memories. Now watching researchers and students filter out as evening approached, he wondered how many of them knew what really happened in the basement levels. The decoded entries from Silas's journal lay open on the passenger seat, along with printouts of building layouts Marcus had managed to obtain. Level 3 wasn't on any official blueprints, but Silas had drawn crude maps in his coded notes. Whatever was happening down there, someone had gone to great lengths to keep it hidden. A soft tap on his window nearly made him jump out of his skin. Finian stood there looking even more ragged than before. Fresh bruises darkened his jaw, and there was a wild, haunted look in his eyes that hadn't been there yesterday. They know, he whispered as Cassius lowered the window. They know you're getting close. I heard them talking about you. His voice cracked, about what they might have to do. Cassius felt ice spread through his veins. Who, Finian? Who was talking? The boy glanced nervously over his shoulder before leaning closer. Your brother, Jasper. I saw him meeting with them in the parking garage. He said, Finian swallowed hard. He said maybe you needed to have an accident too. The world seemed to tilt sideways. Cassius had suspected Jasper's involvement, but hearing it confirmed, hearing that his own brother was actively plotting his death, made him physically ill. Memories flooded his mind. Jasper teaching Silas to ride a bike, helping him with science projects, cheering at his MIT graduation. Had it all been a lie? There's more. Finian continued, his voice barely audible. I know why Silas started investigating. He saw me one night being taken into the building. He tried to interfere, but Jasper was there. He told Silas to forget what he saw, that it was classified research, important work. The boy's eyes filled with tears, but Silas wouldn't let it go. He started following them, documenting everything, and then And then they killed him. Cassius finished, his voice hollow. My own brother helped murder my son. Finian nodded, then tensed suddenly. Someone's coming. Meet me at midnight, behind the old chemistry building. I'll show you how to get to level 3. He melted into the shadows just as a campus security vehicle turned the corner. Cassius drove home in a daze, his mind racing. He needed proof, something concrete that would expose not just Jasper but the entire operation. Whatever they were doing to those street kids, whatever Silas had discovered, it had to be documented somewhere. Back in his study, he pulled up old photos of Jasper on his computer. His brother's face smiled back at him from countless family gatherings, holidays, celebrations. In one photo taken just days before Silas's death, Jasper stood with his arm around his nephew, both of them grinning at the camera. But now Cassius noticed something he'd missed before. The tension in Silas's shoulders, the slight distance he kept from his uncle, the way his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. He was still staring at the photo when his phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Watch your back. Jay knows you're investigating. Be careful who you trust. The message vanished seconds after he read it, leaving Cassius with a growing sense of dread. His hands shook as he reached for Silas's journal. Again, there had to be more. Something he'd missed in the coded entries. His son had been too smart, too thorough to leave such dangerous information without backup. As he flipped through the pages, a small piece of paper fluttered to the floor. It was a receipt from a coffee shop near MIT, dated the day before Silas died. On the back, in his son's precise handwriting, was a series of numbers, different from the code he'd been using in the journal. Cassius stared at the numbers, his mind racing. They weren't dates or coordinates. They looked like a phone. Number? No, too many digits. A sequence? And then it hit him. They were numbers corresponding to letters, a name. His blood ran cold as he decoded it. Jasper Hawthorne. And below it, 2 words that made his heart stop. Project Shadow. The sound of breaking glass downstairs shattered the silence. Cassius quickly pocketed the receipt and journal, his pulse racing. Someone was in the house again, but this time he wasn't running. Heavy footsteps approached his study. Cassius moved silently behind the door, gripping a heavy brass paperweight from his desk. The door creaked open slowly, and a familiar silhouette appeared in the doorway. I'm sorry it's come to this, brother. Jasper's voice was eerily calm. But you never could leave well enough alone, just like Silas. The name of his murdered son on his brother's lips ignited something in Cassius, a rage so pure it felt like fire in his veins. As Jasper stepped into the room, Cassius realized this confrontation had been inevitable from the moment Finian first appeared at Silas's grave. The truth about his son's death had finally been spoken aloud, and there was no going back. Tonight, one way or another, the lies would end. The study air grew thick with tension as the 2 brothers faced each other in the dim lamplight. Jasper's familiar face, the one Cassius had trusted his entire life, now seemed like a stranger's mask. His younger brother looked immaculate as always in his tailored suit, but there was something cold and reptilian in his eyes that Cassius had never noticed before, or perhaps had never wanted to see. You know what's funny, Cass? Jasper said, using the childhood nickname that now felt like poison. If you had just stayed in your grief like a normal person, none of this would be necessary. He moved further into the room, his expensive shoes silent on the Persian rug. But you had to start digging, just like Silas, always digging where you shouldn't. Cassius tightened his grip on the brass paperweight behind his back. Tell me why, he demanded, his voice rough with emotion. He was your nephew, Jasper. You watched him grow up. You helped him with his science projects. How could you be part of what? Jasper's laugh was hollow. Part of groundbreaking research that will change the world? Part of advances in human potential that most people can't even imagine? His face hardened. Silas was brilliant, yes, but he was also naive. When he stumbled onto Project Shadow, he couldn't see the bigger picture. All he saw were a few street kids being given a greater purpose, A greater purpose? Cassius felt bile rise in his throat. You were experimenting on children. Finian told me everything. The basement labs, the disappearances, the cover-ups. At the mention of Finian's name, something flickered in Jasper's eyes. Ah yes, our little survivor. The one that got away. He shook his head. Did you really think it was a coincidence that he showed up at Silas's grave? That he just happened to find you at the right moment? Cold realization washed over Cassius. What did you do? I arranged for him to find you, Jasper said simply. We've been watching him for years, waiting for the right moment. Who better to lead you into a trap than a poor, innocent child with a tragic story? He smiled, and it was terrible to behold. And you played your part perfectly, brother, just like Silas did. The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. The break-ins at my house, the mysterious messages, the bruises on Finian. Cassius felt sick. It was all staged. You manipulated everything. Of course we did. Jasper checked his watch casually. And right now, Finian is leading a special response team straight to Building 68, where they'll find a deranged millionaire, breaking into a secure facility, presumably driven mad by grief over his son's death. He sighed. It's tragic, really. Another terrible accident in the Hawthorne family. Rage and betrayal burned through Cassius's veins like acid. Why tell me all this? Why not just kill me like you killed Silas? Because you deserve to know, brother, to understand that everything, Silas's death, Finian's appearance, your investigation, it was all part of the plan. We needed to know if anyone else had accessed Silas's research, if he'd left any evidence behind. Jasper's eyes gleamed. And you led us right to it. The journal, the decoded coordinates, the receipt with Project Shadow's name. Cassius had done exactly what they wanted, following the breadcrumbs they'd laid out, revealing anything they might have missed. And Finian? Cassius asked, stalling for time as he heard movement in the hallway behind Jasper. He's just a child. He's a loose end, Jasper said coldly. One that will be tied up tonight, along with you. He reached into his jacket, and Cassius caught the glint of metal. I am sorry, Cass, but Project Shadow is bigger than family, bigger than any individual life. Just then, a small figure darted through the doorway, crashing into Jasper from behind. The gun went flying as Finian, the real Finian, not the trap Jasper had described, tackled him with desperate strength. Run! The boy screamed at Cassius. The police are coming, the real police. Mark has found proof. Jasper roared in rage, throwing Finian off. The boy hit the bookshelf hard but scrambled back to his feet. Cassius lunged forward, swinging the brass paperweight, but Jasper was faster than he expected. His brother's fist connected with his jaw, sending him staggering. The sounds of sirens filled the air outside. Jasper's face contorted with fury and desperation. You've ruined everything, he snarled, diving for the gun. But Finian was there first, kicking it across the floor to Cassius. Time seemed to slow as Cassius picked up the weapon, aiming it at his brother's chest. Jasper froze, his hands raised, that cold smile still playing on his lips. You won't shoot me, Cass, he said softly. You're not a killer, not like me. Cassius's hand trembled as memories flooded his mind. Jasper teaching him to ride a bike, defending him from bullies, standing beside him at their parents' funeral. His brother, his protector, his son's murderer. You're right, Cassius said, finally. I'm not like you. He lowered the gun slightly and Finian struck, swinging a heavy crystal paperweight at Jasper's head. The impact dropped him like a stone. As footsteps thundered up the stairs, Cassius pulled Finian close, shielding him. The boy was shaking, but his eyes were clear and determined. I'm sorry, he whispered. I had to let them think their plan was working. It was the only way to get proof. Cassius held him tighter as Marcus burst in with a team of FBI agents, their weapons trained on Jasper's unconscious form. You have nothing to be sorry for, he said softly. You helped bring justice for Silas, for all of them. Dawn broke over Boston Harbor as Cassius sat in an austere FBI interrogation room, the events of the night replaying in his mind like a nightmare. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across the metal table where photos from Building 68's basement lay scattered, evidence of horrors that made his stomach turn. Children strapped to examination tables, medical equipment that belonged in a torture chamber, documentation of experiments that defied human decency. Across the table, Special Agent Sarah Martinez watched him with sympathetic eyes as she reviewed his statement. The veteran FBI agent had been investigating Project Shadow for months, but hadn't been able to crack the organization's careful facade until Marcus contacted her with evidence from Silas's journal. "We found something else in the basement," she said softly, sliding a sealed evidence bag across the table. Inside was a USB drive, its surface scratched and worn. It was hidden inside a maintenance panel. "The timestamp on the files matches the day before your son died." Cassius's hands trembled as he stared at the drive. "Silas's backup," he whispered. "He must have hidden it there when he realized they were onto him." Agent Martinez nodded, her face grave. "The drive contains video footage. We think you should see it." She hesitated. "But I have to warn you, Mr. Hawthorne, it's not easy to watch." The agent set up a laptop, and Cassius felt his heart stop as Silas's face appeared on the screen. His son looked exhausted, terrified, but determined. The timestamp showed 2:17 a.m. the night before his death. "If you're watching this," Silas began, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes, "then something has happened to me. Everything I'm about to say is true, and I have proof in the encrypted files on this drive." Cassius pressed his hands against the table to stop them from shaking as his son detailed the horrific truth about Project Shadow. How he'd discovered them targeting homeless children for experimental drug trials. How he'd found connections to powerful people in politics, law enforcement, and academia. How his own uncle, Jasper Hawthorne, was one of the project's key administrators. "They're calling it breakthrough research in human enhancement," Silas continued, his voice bitter. "But they're torturing children, destroying lives, and covering up deaths. I've documented everything, the fake accident reports, the falsified medical records, the money trails, it's all here." The video jumped, and suddenly Silas was looking over his shoulder, panic clear on his face. "Someone's coming. Dad, if you see this, I'm sorry. I couldn't stop them in time. But maybe now, with this evidence," his voice cracked. "I love you, Dad. Remember what you always taught me. The truth matters more than anything, even if it hurts, even if it costs." The video cut off abruptly. Cassius realized he was crying, silent tears tracking down his face. His son had died a hero, trying to save children no one else cared about. Just like Finian. "Where is he?" Cassius asked suddenly, looking around. "Where's Finian?" "He's safe," Agent Martinez assured him. "We have him in protective custody. He's been incredibly brave, helping us gather evidence these past few weeks. The bruises, the staged encounters. It was all part of the plan to make Project Shadow think they were in control." Cassius felt a mix of pride and pain. He risked everything to help expose the truth. Just like Silas. "There's something else you should know," Martinez said carefully. "Finian, he was one of their first test subjects 3 years ago. He escaped during the same week Silas started investigating. Your son..." She paused, choosing her words. "Your son helped him get away. That's how he first discovered what was happening in the basement." The revelation hit Cassius like a physical blow. Silas hadn't just stumbled onto Project Shadow. He'd actively chosen to help a terrified child escape their clutches. And in doing so, he'd signed his own death warrant. The boy's testimony, combined with Silas's evidence and what we found in the basement, is enough to bring down the entire operation. Martinez continued. "We're already making arrests across the city. Jasper's associates in the police department, the medical examiners who falsified reports, the MIT administrators who looked the other way. They're all going down." Cassius nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. He was thinking of Silas, not as the victim he'd mourned for 3 years, but as the hero he'd truly been. His son had faced impossible odds, sacrificed everything to protect children like Finian from monsters who saw them as nothing more than test subjects. "Can I see him?" Cassius asked. "Finian, I mean. He shouldn't be alone right now." Martinez's expression softened. "Follow me." They found Finian in a comfortable interview room, wrapped in a blanket and devouring a sandwich. When he saw Cassius, his face lit up with a mixture of relief and uncertainty. "Did they show you?" he asked quietly. "The video?" Cassius knelt beside the boy's chair, seeing him clearly for the first time, not as a mysterious figure in the cemetery, but as the child Silas had given his life to protect. "Thank you," he said softly, "for helping bring them to justice, for helping me understand what kind of man my son really was." Finian's eyes filled with tears. "He saved my life," he whispered. "I had to make sure everyone knew the truth about him, about what they did to all of us." Cassius pulled the boy into a gentle hug, feeling him tremble with exhaustion and relief. Together, they had exposed a darkness that had claimed too many innocent lives. But more importantly, they had restored Silas's legacy, not as a victim of a tragic accident, but as a hero who died fighting for justice. The courthouse on Pemberton Square loomed like a fortress against the pale December sky, its granite facade a testament to the weight of justice about to be served within. Cassius sat in the front row of the packed courtroom, his hand resting protectively on Finian's shoulder. The boy was dressed in a new suit that still seemed to make him uncomfortable, but his eyes were clear and determined as they watched Jasper being led in, shackled and wearing prison orange. 3 weeks had passed since the night of confrontation in Cassius's study. In that time, Project Shadow had been exposed in its entirety, its dark tendrils reaching into every corner of Boston's power structure. The evidence from Silas's hidden drive, combined with Finian's testimony in the FBI's investigation, had brought down dozens of conspirators, police officers, doctors, researchers, all complicit in the exploitation and deaths of countless vulnerable children. But today was different. Today, Jasper Hawthorne would finally confess to his role in Silas's murder. The courtroom fell silent as Jasper took the stand. He looked smaller somehow, diminished without his expensive suits and carefully maintained facade. His eyes met Cassius's, briefly before dropping away, unable to hold his brother's gaze. "Please state your name for the record," the prosecutor began, her voice sharp in the hushed courtroom. "Jasper Alexander Hawthorne," he replied, his voice hollow. "And you understand that by entering this plea today, you are admitting to your role in the death of Silas James Hawthorne, as well as your involvement in Project Shadow?" "Yes." The word seemed to cost him physical pain. What followed was a confession that made the gathered journalists' pens scratch furiously across their notepads. Jasper detailed how Project Shadow had begun as legitimate research into cognitive enhancement, but had quickly evolved into something darker when they discovered the potential for human modification. They needed test subjects who wouldn't be missed. Homeless children, runaways, the invisible ones of society. "Silas discovered what we were doing completely by accident," Jasper continued, his voice growing hoarse. "He was working late in his lab when he heard sounds from the restricted basement level. He found Finian there, strapped to an examination table, and helped him escape." Finian tensed under Cassius's hand, remembering that night. Cassius squeezed his shoulder gently, grounding him in the present. "We thought we could convince him to keep quiet," Jasper went on. "He was family after all. But Silas..." His voice cracked. "Silas was too much like his father, too committed to the truth no matter the cost. When he threatened to expose everything, the board made a decision. They ordered me to handle it." The courtroom seemed to hold its collective breath as Jasper described that final night. How they had ambushed Silas in the parking garage after he'd hidden his evidence. How they had injected him with an experimental compound designed to simulate the effects of alcohol. How they had placed his unconscious body in his car and staged the accident. "He never regained consciousness," Jasper said, tears finally breaking through his composed facade. "We made sure of that. The compound, it was designed to be undetectable, to look like natural causes. We never meant for him to suffer." "You bastard," Cassius whispered, his voice shaking with rage. Finian grabbed his hand, holding it tight. The prosecutor's questions continued, methodically exposing every detail of the conspiracy. Jasper's responses grew more mechanical, as if distancing himself from his own actions. But when asked about his motivations, something in him seemed to crack. "You want to know why?" he asked, suddenly looking directly at Cassius. "Because I believed in what we were doing, the potential for human enhancement, for evolution itself. It was worth any price, or so I thought." He laughed bitterly. "I told myself Silas's death was necessary for the greater good. But watching my brother mourn him for 3 years, seeing what we did to children like Finian," his voice broke completely. "I was wrong. God help me. I was so wrong." Cassius felt tears running down his face, but he didn't bother to wipe them away. Next, to him, Finian was crying too, silent tears tracking down his cheeks. The truth they had fought so hard to uncover was finally being spoken aloud, but it brought no joy, only a deep, aching sadness for all that had been lost. After Jasper's testimony, the judge called a recess. As the courtroom began to empty, Jasper was led past their row. He stopped despite the bailiff's warning tug on his arm. "Cassius," he said softly, "I know it means nothing now, but I'm sorry. Not just for Silas, but for betraying everything our family stood for. You deserved better than a brother like me." Cassius looked at his brother, really looked at him, for the first time since this nightmare began. He saw not the monster who had murdered his son, but a man who had lost his way so completely that he'd destroyed everything he claimed to love. "You're right," Cassius replied, his voice steady. "It means nothing. But Silas would want me to tell you that I forgive you, not for your sake, but for his. Because that's the kind of man my son was, the kind of man you helped murder." Jasper's face crumpled as the bailiff led him away. Finian tugged at Cassius's sleeve, his young face wise beyond its years. "Are you really going to forgive him?" Cassius pulled the boy close. This child who had helped him find the truth about his son's death, who had shown the same courage Silas had in fighting against impossible odds. "Someday maybe, but for now we have work to do. Silas would want us to make sure nothing like Project Shadow ever happens again." Together they walked out of the courthouse into the weak winter sunlight, carrying the weight of truth and the promise of justice yet to come. The January wind howled through Boston streets as Cassius made his final visit to Building 68. The FBI had finished processing the scene, and tomorrow demolition crews would begin erasing all traces of Project Shadow's underground facility. But tonight, accompanied by Agent Martinez and Finian, Cassius needed to see it one last time, needed to understand the place where his son had made his final stand. The basement levels felt colder than the winter night above, their sterile corridors still bearing signs of the hasty evacuation that followed the FBI raid. Empty filing cabinets gaped open, their contents now filling evidence boxes. Abandoned medical equipment cast grotesque shadows on the walls. The air itself seemed heavy with the echoes of suffering. Finian stayed close to Cassius, his small hand gripping the older man's coat. This was his first time back since his escape 3 years ago, and his courage in facing these demons made Cassius's heart ache. The boy had grown stronger over the past month, proper food and care bringing color back to his cheeks, but the shadows in his eyes might never fully fade. "This is where Silas found me," Finian said softly, stopping outside a heavy steel door marked Lab 7. His voice trembled but didn't break. "I was strapped down, and they had just injected me with something that burned like fire. I was screaming, but they just kept taking notes. Then suddenly he was there, throwing off his lab coat to wrap around me, telling me to run." Agent Martinez documented everything with her camera as Finian continued, his testimony adding crucial details to the case against the remaining Project Shadow conspirators. 28 arrests so far, with more coming as the investigation expanded across state lines. The evidence suggested similar facilities in other cities, other children who hadn't been as lucky as Finian. They reached the lowest level, where Silas had hidden his damning evidence the night before his death. The maintenance panel still hung open, its hiding place now empty. But something caught Cassius's eye. A small scratch in the metal, deliberate and precise. "Wait," he said, kneeling to examine it closer. The mark was tiny but unmistakable. S.J.H., his son's initials, carved with what must have been a screwdriver or key. A final signature, a last act of defiance. Finian touched the initials gently. He knew they were coming for him, he whispered, but he still made sure the truth would be found. The truth. It had cost Silas his life, had torn apart the Hawthorne family, had exposed corruption at the highest levels of Boston society. But it had also saved lives, not just Finian's, but countless other potential victims who would never know how close they'd come to becoming Project Shadow's test subjects. As they prepared to leave, Cassius noticed Finian lingering in Lab 7's doorway. The boy's face was set in lines of concentration, as if making a difficult decision. "What is it?" Cassius asked softly. "I remember something else," Finian said. "Something I was too scared to tell before." He took a deep breath. "The night Silas helped me escape, he said something to one of the doctors. He said, 'My father taught me that real science serves humanity, not destroys it.' Then he looked right at your brother and said, 'Remember that when you try to sleep at night, Uncle Jasper.'" The words hit Cassius like a physical blow. He remembered that conversation with Silas years ago when his son was just starting at MIT. They had been discussing ethical guidelines and research, and Cassius had shared his father's wisdom about the responsibility that came with scientific knowledge. Agent Martinez finished documenting the scene, her footsteps echoing in the empty corridor. "We should go," she said gently. "The demolition crew arrives at dawn." As they rode the elevator back to the surface, Cassius felt a strange sense of peace settling over him. The questions that had haunted him for 3 years had been answered. The truth about his son's death had been exposed. Justice, legal justice at least, was being served. But there was one more thing he needed to do. The next morning, as workers began dismantling Building 68's dark legacy, Cassius sat in his study with adoption papers spread across his desk. Finian sat across from him, his eyes wide with disbelief as he read the documents. You want to adopt me?" the boy asked, his voice barely a whisper. Cassius reached across the desk to take Finian's hand. "Silas saw something in you worth dying for," he said softly. "He believed in protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. I can't think of a better way to honor his memory than by finishing what he started, by giving you the home and family you deserve." Tears spilled down Finian's cheeks as he nodded, unable to speak. Outside, the sound of demolition began. Not destruction, Cassius realized, but renewal. They were tearing down the walls that had hidden so much darkness, making way for something new to grow. Later that day, father and son stood together at Silas's grave. The winter sun broke through the clouds, casting long shadows across the snow-covered cemetery. Finian placed a single rose on the headstone, then stepped back to stand beside Cassius. "Do you think he'd be happy?" the boy asked. "About everything that happened?" Cassius wrapped an arm around his new son's shoulders, feeling the weight of past and future balanced perfectly in this moment. "Yes," he said simply. "I think he'd be very happy indeed." Spring had finally come to Boston, bringing with it a gentle warmth that seemed to wash away the last traces of winter's darkness. The cherry trees lining Oakwood Cemetery were in full bloom, their pink petals drifting like snow across the carefully tended graves. Among them, Silas's headstone stood freshly cleaned, with new flowers brightening its base. Cassius knelt to arrange the bouquet, aware of Finian's presence beside him. 6 months had passed since the boy had officially become his son, and the transformation was remarkable. No longer the frightened child from the cemetery, Finian now stood tall and strong, his eyes bright with intelligence and purpose. He was thriving in his new school, showing the same brilliant aptitude for science that had marked Silas's young life. "Dad," Finian said softly, the words still new and precious between them. "I found something in Silas's old room last night." From his pocket, he pulled out a small leather notebook, different from the one that had helped expose Project Shadow. It was hidden behind his bookshelf. I think I think you should read it." Cassius accepted the notebook with trembling hands. The pages were filled with Silas's familiar handwriting, but these weren't research notes or coded messages. They were personal thoughts, hopes, fears, a window into his son's final weeks that he'd never expected to find. The last entry was dated the morning of his death. "Dear Dad, if you're reading this, something has happened to me. I know the risks I'm taking by exposing Project Shadow, but I can't walk away. Not after what I've seen, not after meeting Finian and the others. You taught me that real strength isn't in what we can do, but in what we choose to do when faced with impossible choices. I've hidden the evidence where they won't find it. Proof of everything, the experiments, the cover-ups, Uncle Jasper's involvement. But more importantly, I want you to know why I had to do this. It wasn't just about exposing corruption or bringing down the guilty. It was about protecting the innocent, giving voice to those who had none. There's a quote you used to read to me from your favorite book. The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. I couldn't do nothing, Dad. I couldn't look away. If that cost me my life, know that I faced that cost willingly, knowing what was at stake. And if you're reading this, it means you didn't look away either. You kept searching for the truth, just like you taught me to do. I'm proud of that. Proud to be your son. Take care of Finian if you can. He reminds me so much of myself at that age. Curious, determined, unafraid to question things. He deserves a chance at the life Project Shadow tried to steal from him. I love you, Dad. Never doubt that. And never doubt that what we do matters, even when the price seems too high." Silas' tears blurred Cassius's vision as he closed the notebook. Beside him, Finian leaned against his shoulder, offering silent comfort. Together they watched the cherry blossoms dance across Silas's grave, nature's own tribute to a life cut short but lived with purpose. "I've been thinking," Finian said after a while, "about what I want to do when I grow up." He straightened, his young face serious. "I want to be like Silas. Not just in science, but in standing up for what's right. There are still people out there doing wrong things in the name of progress. Someone needs to stop them." Cassius looked at his adopted son, this miracle who had brought both heartbreak and healing into his life, and saw echoes of Silas in his determined expression. "Your brother would be proud of you," he said softly. "Just as I am." They stayed until sunset, sharing stories about Silas, not the tragic hero who had exposed Project Shadow, but the boy who had loved robots and silly jokes, who had spent hours explaining complex theories to anyone who would listen, who had seen injustice and refused to look away. As they prepared to leave, Finian placed one last flower on the grave. "I never got to thank him properly," he said, "for saving my life that night, for giving me a chance at a real family." Cassius wrapped an arm around his son's shoulders. "He knew," he said simply, "just like he knew the truth would come out eventually. That's why he left us the tools to find it, his journal, his hidden evidence, and you." They walked back, through the cherry trees, their path strewn with pink petals. Behind them, Silas's headstone stood as a testament not just to what had been lost, but to what had been gained: justice, healing, and a new kind of family forged in the pursuit of truth. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of gold and rose, promising another tomorrow. And in that moment, both father and son knew with absolute certainty that wherever Silas was, he was smiling.